everyone. Thank you for coming. I think this volume is fine, right? We don't need a microphone. Okay, you let me know if I start screaming or if I start whispering. So today I'm going to talk to you about diversity in historic preservation. And when Lauren and I started thinking about what this talk could be, it has to do with the work I've been doing since moving to Seattle, which has been, for obvious reasons, mostly focused on how my different perspective can bring to the table. I was born, raised, and educated in Mexico. I went to architecture school in Mexico, and I was trained in Mexico's National School for Historic Preservation, which allowed me to work for Mexico's National Agency of Historic Preservation and Archaeology, and I was able to participate in projects that went from archaeological sites of pre-Hispanic cultures to 16th century convents to what we call recent architecture in Mexico, which is the start of the 20th century. And when I got to Seattle, that perspective has allowed me to see things differently from people who have been trained in the US, and that's kind of what I bring to the table. I'm going to talk to you about just some basic concepts about what historic preservation is defined and diversity, and then we'll take it from there. The idea is for us to have questions in the end, but if you have a question in the middle, please feel free to ask it. Okay? Let's start. I have my notes here, so I'm going to multitask. I'm going to start with something very simple. What is historic preservation? Which seems to be, whenever we're talking in historic preservation, something that it's not as easy to define as we would think. Even if you just look for a definition of historic preservation, it's hard to find something that is a universal definition. Most agencies or organizations have their own definition. That's very interesting to start to see how each agency defines historic preservation. So when you start working with someone, just understanding what do they think is historic preservation, it's a great place to start. So, for example, this is the webpage from National Park Service, and what is historic preservation on this webpage? And it's you see I highlighted a few aspects, which is the questions that are asked when they think about historic preservation. What is important in our history, and what parts of our past can we preserve for the future? I think there's two aspects that are very interesting here, which is kind of like this history and the idea of the future. Okay, historic preservation is kind of that practice of looking back and seeing what's of value and what do we want to rescue, and then kind of push it forward to the future of what we want to preserve for future generations. So if you see this, there's the component really of the present is kind of just us passing something from here to here. And I feel this a very important aspect because sometimes, and I will look at it throughout the presentation, sometimes when talking with historic preservation, there's people and organizations that tend to be too much about the present. It's what's going on affects most of their decisions, or the decisions are being made based on what's going on at the present. And in reality, in historic preservation, we are really not important. We meaning the present. We are just the carriers of the past and history towards the future. So now, what is diversity? This is just a basic definition of diversity, and it's the inclusion of different types of people, such as people of different races or cultures, in a group organization. That's it. So then, diversity in historic preservation then could be defined as inclusion of different types of people, different races or cultures, in what we preserve for the future. Okay? So that's basically what, when we speak about diversity in historic preservation, basically that's what we're talking about. Okay? I'm going to talk in terms of those two things, okay? Using different races or cultures and how that is part of the conversation of historic preservation. Just send my notes and okay. This is from the department, the Washington State's Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation webpage. And I looked into what's historic preservation, so I went into historic buildings, okay? And this is what I found. And this was a discovery for me, a recent discovery when I was preparing for this presentation. So this was nothing that it's not something that I knew was there, and I was not expecting this, but this is what I found. Historic buildings, this is Washington State, has a rich built environment that includes buildings, structures, districts, and objects that date back to the 1850s. These historic resources have been recorded since the early 1900s and provide a valuable physical reminder of our past. The historic era, this is the part in yellow, the historic era is considered to begin at the time of first European contact with Native Americans. For present-day Washington State, this contact usually dates to the 1790s. What do you think about this? So, this is kind of in a graph. We're in a graph. The start of history is apparently 1790s. I didn't know. And then those are the historic places. And then the rest is kind of natural made markers. Okay, it's just things that are wonderfully created by nature. Then 1790s, the start of history. I can't even start from how bad this is. I can't imagine if I was presenting this, or if a Native American reads the page, what they must feel. It's incomprehensible to me that that's the webpage in our State Department, especially because I know that that's not how they are operating, but just that's the language. And sometimes it's just a question about language. But then again, if I'm just starting to do some research in historic preservation, I want to know what's more about it. I'm interested in the story. Let's think of someone like me, recent immigrant. I want to get more involved. I want to learn more about the history of Washington State, and I want to know more about the historic buildings. This is what I'm presented with first. This is the speech or this discourse, is that a word? And I find it particularly interesting because this idea of history starts in a date. Remember back when we went to school, the definition of where history starts, it's supposed to be where writing starts, where the recordings start. So then, I guess, in a way, maybe it's been understood like that. We don't know what was before, and so therefore history starts when Europeans first encountered. I find it interesting because in Mexico we have a very similar, I wouldn't say understanding, but method of organizing our past too. And the thing is that our date is 1521. History starts in 1521. And it actually, right now I don't remember the exact date, but it's a specific day when history starts. And that's the day when the Aztec city of Tenochtitlan fell to the Spanish, I don't want to go, I guess it was the Spanish army. That's the date where history starts in Mexico, And before that, everything we call it archaeological. Now, this is, we understand that that is not accurate, but it's just the way that legally it was decided that it could work. So in Mexico, the law dates back from the 70s, and when that conversation was had, it's like, when do we put this date? Now, in the case of Mexico, the reason is because everything that is before 1521 is by law immediately an archaeological heritage, and it's owned by the state. So anything, it can be a little piece of rock, or it can be a big archaeological site, but if it predates 1521, then it's protected by the most rigorous laws in Mexico. If it's from 1521 to the 8th of the 19th century, so literally the last minute of December 31st of 1899, then it's historic. And there's the second level of protection, where many buildings are protected right away. For example, churches, convents, schools, or most public buildings. And then things that were built starting the 20th century, so the first day of 1900, those are no longer historic, or they cannot aspire to be historic. They are too new. They can be artistic. They can have artistic value, but not historic. Of course, that's not a perfect law, and I don't know what's going to happen as we keep going more and more, and there's, of course, more historic things that have happened during the 20th century. But then I found this interpretation interesting because it's kind of what we do in Mexico, but the connotation given on the website makes it feel that there was nothing before, or at least that's the way I read it and I feel it. So that's just to see how bad some things are when we talk about diversity in historic preservation. It seems to be kind of something that should be more advanced, but then in some ways, this is really, really in its starting phase. So let me see if this, I want to take a big figures. I will post it this. So I just want to take a scroll down fast through the National Park Service of Washington State. And of course, I know this is just the national parks, and there's lots more of historic places that are not national parks. But just as a quick glance of why it's the most, like this is the highest level of protection that we can ask for. So this is our national parks in the state of Washington. Okay, so I'm just going to scroll it down for you. You see there's many that are shared with other states. So, okay, I'm almost done. Those are, so, do you think this captures the state of Washington? Is this our history? Is this just, that's what's happened in Washington State? It's such a small part. And again, I know this is the highest level of protection. But again, the idea of diversity is that if you take a peek of what's protected, you should get kind of like that idea of what the history of that place is. And what I see is that, again, is this idea that is posted with words of the natural marvels of the state, such as the Olympic National Park, and then there's this idea of the start of history, with things that are from the 1800s coming forward. Okay. So I guess what I want you to think about it is this the story? We could just tell the story of our state through these national parks. Which, think about it. Many people, that's how they know other states, visiting their national parks. So is that it? Is that all we have to say and we have to add to the national conversation and the world conversation? Now I need to go back. Now I want to show you. This is the city of Tacoma's historic preservation webpage. Okay, if you go into the city of Tacoma and then into historic preservation, this is what you find. Tacoma is rich with culture, history, archaeological resources, and historic architecture. From the earliest Native American inhabitants to waves of immigrants from around the world. Many peoples contributed to Tacoma's cultural landscapes and the city that we live in today. The Historic Preservation Office is dedicated to preserving that legacy. It's not because they invited me, but it's just such a different narrative from the start compared to what we just saw from the State Department. Now, the question would be, how can we achieve diversity in historic preservation? I recently was fortunate to attend a training, well, it wasn't maybe that recent, but I was able to attend a training on equality and diversity, and one of the things that really stuck with me is that you can never speak about more diversity. Something is either diverse or it's not diverse, and you shouldn't say levels of diversity. So originally I had texted, how can we achieve more diversity, and then I corrected myself. Okay, how can we achieve diversity in historic preservation? So I'm going to give some pointers. This is not a 4-step program or anything like that. It's just some thoughts that I've learned along the way, and they are they're kind of in order, but it's mostly things that I've started to point out by myself about what can really be done to achieve diversity. One of the things that I find that is a good starting point is to expand from the concept of historic to the notion of cultural heritage. So even the word historic preservation gives that connotation of something has to be historic. And history, as we just saw, can be interpreted in a very rigorous way. It has a start, it has an ending, it has to do with a certain narrative. So when we first, I think in a way, we need to think beyond that idea of historic. And so what is cultural heritage? I'm going to try to talk about this a little bit in the next few slides. There's not really a definition I can just give you of cultural heritage because it's kind of the same of historic preservation. Everyone gives their own definition of cultural heritage. But I'm going to try to explain it in different ways. Now, cultural heritage is made of 2 equal parts, which is tangible heritage and intangible heritage. And it's important, and I cannot stress this enough, to think about this as 2 equal parts. It's not one encompasses the other, or not one is 75% more important and the other one is just 25. So it's really of these 2 concepts. So, cultural heritage is a concept that is really not new. The first definitions of such go back all the way to ancient Rome. And it's really as long as this idea of historic preservation has existed. But I think that, well, it's not I think, it's the highest organism that you can look up to for talks about cultural heritage is UNESCO. all the laws from the different countries really derive from that. The good thing about UNESCO is that it has really kept going, and it is not, they didn't put up a definition in the 50s and then left it there. They really strive to keep adding different aspects to the conversation. So then yearly there's more and more aspects that are included, and that's why it's always good to go back to UNESCO and see what's new or how they are even referring their own definitions in a new way as the years go by. So what is cultural heritage? And I like this definition that I found on one of the web page, because it does this narrative. It just does not, cultural heritage does not end at monuments and collections of objects, which is what happens mostly when we just talk about historic. That's what represents history for many people: monuments and collections of objects. So the big buildings and things that are in museums, and that's historic. But cultural heritage is more than that. It includes also the other part, which is the intangible heritage, which are oral traditions, performing arts, social practices, rituals, festive events, knowledge and practices concerning nature and the universe, or the knowledge and skills to produce traditional crafts. So intangible cultural heritage is an equally important factor in maintaining cultural diversity in the face of growing globalization. The importance of intangible cultural heritage is not the cultural manifestation itself. So everything that is around or behind it. And again, think about this as two equal and important parts. This is a building that was surveyed by Susan Johnson, present here, with this wonderful photo. This is the Salvadoran Bakery in Seattle, and we included this building for the Latino Heritage Survey for Seattle that we worked for the year before this one. So this survey was a very good example of how this conflicting idea of what historic, and for it to be preserved it needs to be historic, and the difference between when the intangible is left out or when the tangible is given more importance. This is a Salvadoran bakery in Seattle. That the building itself, it's a 1950s building, a commercial building that was a laundromat, and at some point, and I don't remember how it started, and then in the, I think, 80s, became the Salvadoran bakery. Salvadoran bakery is part restaurant, part bakery, and it's of course run by two Salvadoran sisters, and it's really a community place. It's really a place where the Salvadoran community goes for food and for home. It's not just a restaurant. Now this is a great example to understand those two aspects. Although we included in the survey the building itself is not important. It's not because it has architectural value, it's not because it's an important style in architecture, it's not because its materials or its craftsmanship is outstanding. It's because of what happens in that building. But that intangible heritage, it's attached to that building. We cannot save in a box intangible heritage, but the fantastic and amazing thing about historic preservation of buildings is that we can preserve the building, and the building becomes kind of like that box in a way that holds that intangible heritage. Now, however, it is very important to understand that as long as that restaurant is important, that what gives value to that building is that restaurant. Now let's say that 25 years, that business goes out of business and the building stands. Then it's still important because that's where it happened. It would be like saying, well, Gettysburg is no longer important because I don't see the battle happening. Okay, so it's just something that really is a container, but what is really important is not the building itself. The building is could be whatever building, but what is important is what happens in that building and what surrounds that building. And in this case, it's the community of that part of Seattle that has been going for decades to that bakery. And it's a way of showing home to new generations, and it's also a way of passing along many traditions through one place. So when I started this talk, I was saying that preservation is kind of like, we do the place of taking things from the past and throwing into the future. This restaurant is kind of doing that with their traditions and, if you want, in form of food and bread, but it's a way for a container of traditions from home to people from the Ecuador who live in Seattle. So Intangible Heritages, and I know this is a long text, you don't have to, of course, read it, but I just couldn't figure out what to cut, so I just put it on. But Intangible Heritage is, as defined by UNESCO, traditional, contemporary, and living at the same time. Okay, because it has to be something that is going on now. It's not really just in the past as an artifact that was made. It's inclusive because it's something that is shared by others and that it can be shared with other people. I can bake a traditional Mexican food and you can eat it. I can even share the recipe if I want to. It's representative because it's the value that it has to represent a community. Okay, so it's representative of that community and then passed from generation to generation. And it's community-based because intangible heritage, for it to be that, needs to be something that is shared. Either traditions that are shared through family, if you think about them, the intangible heritage of your own family, or of a group of a community, or of a nation, or of the world. So then, in a way, by including intangible heritage into preservation, we would open the door for our preservation practice to be more traditional, contemporary, and living, at the same time more inclusive, more representative, and more community-based. Okay, so I think that's the real value of really thinking outside or adding that component of intangible heritage to the protection of tangible heritage, which is what really we've been focusing most of the time. The other thing that can be done to achieve diversity in historic preservation is to get educated about diversity, and especially cultural diversity. I know from experience, and to talk about diversity it's a hard talk to have. It's a hard talk to have within ourselves, with families, and in the large community. So I invite you to start with the idea of cultural diversity and see how you feel from there, and then take that idea forward into just diversity. But cultural diversity is, I think, something that most of us can agree on. And again, I decided to go back to UNESCO to talk about this, and this is UNESCO's Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity. And this is one of the many texts that UNESCO just publishes throughout the decades and the years. And again, as they start seeing the need, they put new declarations like this one. This one is of 2002. So it's 15 years old already, okay? So there's a lot of material since then, okay? But I'm gonna start here. So I'm gonna present a few snippets from it. This is one of the articles, and it's talk about access for all to cultural diversity. And it says, while ensuring the free flow of ideas by word and image, care should be exercised that all cultures can express themselves and make themselves known. Freedom of expression, media pluralism, multilingualism, equal access to art, to scientific and technological knowledge, including in detailed form, and the possibility for all cultures to have access to the means of expression and dissemination are the guarantees of cultural diversity. So if you see this article, it's talking mostly about access, equal access. So this is a good question to ask. Are we giving equal access for all to have that free flow of ideas and that exchange? Are we really being equally given access, or is some groups having more access and then some groups having less access? Now I know this is very small, but I wanted to put the screenshot of the page of the document so you get an idea of how this is presented. This again is also from that same declaration, and it talks about a different approach needs to be taken when discussing or writing about cultural and ethnic diversity. It is often presented as, or at least implied to be, a necessary evil or a constraint that needs to be accommodated and that government must do their best to address. I found this to be so true. Sometimes it's been like, well, the topic of the year, we are given money to do more work on this, so I guess we should do it. And it's just not the right speech. The speech should be more about, again, having that equal access and be not doing as a government requirement, say like that, but let's do it because we believe firmly in it. Living together places citizens on an equal footing while respecting differences. Equality is vital if people are to converse, understand each other, and work side by side. Cultural differences are especially necessary because they constitute the sine qua non, which is like the real need for stimulating and revealing one's own uniqueness. So it's this idea that the more diversity that we are, the more unique we are, in a way. And again, I know this is very small, but I wanted to really present how this information is presented on these documents. So the idea, of course, these are global declarations, and they are passed down to all members of UNESCO, which although right now the US is not a member of UNESCO, remember that, but I hope it once more becomes one. So I'm going to read this part here, from monolithic to multiple identities. I'm going to use my computer too because that's even too small for me. So it says, national identities are not monolithics. They are constructions reflecting a multitude of collective experiences, memories, and references, and encompassing differences of gender, class, race, and religion. They evolve constantly along a path prescribed by a sometimes mythical past towards a future dependent on adaptive change. In a globalizing world, which tends to blur national boundaries and re-energize cultural identities, it makes less and less sense to equate cultural identities with national identities. This said, national identity plays a central role in providing a focus for our sense of commonality. The nation is a key principle of identification, operating through shared set of collective memories, as narrated through popular culture, school curricula, the media, and so forth. Ideas about the continuity of nations are often conveyed through cultural perspective that emphasizes traditions and cultures as a set of fixed and repetitive practices, as a means of forging identity and combating the interdeterminacy of changing events. Like any work of memory, the concept of nation is selective, and in the case of official national identity, often reflects the interests of dominant elites. National identity can also be constructed around the myth of ethnic superiority, as the history of human conflict all too often and tragically attests. Yet, while national symbols and traditions tend to persist, the realities they represent do not stand still, for cultures are ever-changing and self-transforming in a process that is not linear. Culture is like a river flowing through vast areas, giving life to people. It changes all the time, although we go on referring to it as if it was the same river. This is a quote. it has been suggested that we need to understand culture not as a substantive, but as a verb. So these are whatever all the little highlighter texts. And I think there's quite a few things to unpack here. One is this idea of going from a monolithic idea of national identity to multiple identities. Now, I'm also from a big country, a geographically big country, with lots of groups. And in that way, Mexico and the US have the same problem. It's this conflict of, are we Mexicans or are we from one indigenous population or for one immigration population? And it seems to be a conflict that it shouldn't exist. That's why UNESCO urges us to move to multiple identities. So the idea of don't think of your culture or your national identity as one thing that is said and that's it. But rather think about it as something that is flowing and that is really something that we are living. That's why think of it as a verb, not as a substantive. And I also think that UNESCO is, and again, this actually is from another report from 2009, the World Report Investing in Cultural and Diversity and Intercultural Dialogue, this page. And this is 10 years ago. I don't think UNESCO knows the future, but this really, it's like they should cover it this year. If I think about what was happening in 2009, we were still living in a more unified world, if I want to say it like this, or less the talk about national identity in terms of that national identity against multiple cultures was less of a daily news than it is now. So again, UNESCO's urging us to go beyond that national identity idea and move more toward the idea of multiple identities. Now, another thing that is more concrete to achieve diversity in historic preservation is look at your numbers and demographics. If you are an organization or if you just want to know how your city or your state or your country is doing in terms of the diversity of historic preservation, it's fairly easy. You need to look at your numbers and your demographics and say who is represented, so that means, and who is underrepresented. This is from 2019, so this year, and it's the population by race of Washington State. So the big part of the pie is for white, and again, we start talking about race. Then black is the red one, purple is American Indian, Alaska Native, the green is Asian, this gray is Native Hawaii or other Pacific Islanders, and then people who identify by two or more races, okay, which is something that is actually quite new, that it's taking into account that people tend to have sometimes more than one race. Now this is how it looks in 2019. Now, I want you to think, when we're talking about historic preservation, how did this pie chart look 50 years ago or 300 years ago? It wasn't like this. 300 years ago, this little part was the 100%. And now how will it look in 50 years or in 100 years or 300 years? I don't think it will look like this too. So that when we think again about historic preservation being really just a carrier of things to the past, to the future, why is this being the decisive factor? Why is who is now the majority being the decisive factor? I just think it's very unfair. We should always again think about what's the past and what are we bringing to the future. So I think it's important to think always in those two terms, because then we shouldn't be making decisions now that are affecting the representation of people in the future. So I'm going to tell you, I'm remodeling my house. Currently, it's a 1979 house. And one of the bathrooms still has the original tile, and it's in pretty good shape, considering that it's 40 years. Whoever washed that bathroom did a very good job. And I wanted to keep the tile. And the contractor kept pressing me and pressing me and pressing me, and it was, but it's just 40 years old. He said, how do you think that things get to be 100 or 200 years or 500 years? You know, if everyone in this world took the approach of, well, it's just 40 years old, let's just like trash it, there would be nothing to preserve down the road. So my approach to historic preservation is always thinking about it's not really what's important now, it's also what's going to be important in the future. And things that are fairly new now, or maybe not that important now, are going to be important in the future. So right now, things that belong to these pieces of the pie are probably going to be more important as the years go by, because that community is going to grow. This is the other factor of that pie, which is the population of Hispanic and Latino origin, because Latinos is not a race, but it's an ethnicity. So then we as Latinos can identify with whichever race we are from, which is mostly all. And I want to see this chart of the difference between 1980 to 2019. Okay, how that population is growing, and again, thinking about how the heritage of this population, how this part 1980 now, this is history to the Latino population in the state of Washington. These starting places, although they are fairly recent, but to this new generation, their ancestry. And this one is about the most common origin of people who are now residents of Washington State and where were they born. So the most common is Mexico, the second one is India, and the third one is the Philippines. So again, this is also to think how, this is the reality, but then what is historic preservation going to look for the state of Washington in 50 years or 100 years from now? What is going to be really important to these populations in that, in the future? Again, thinking about how we are mostly just carrying one thing from the past towards the future. And I think it's important to have this look in the future when we are taking historic preservation decisions now. And this is the other part of that, how we achieve diversity in historic preservation, and is engage underrepresented communities. And engage them, let me just go to my notes too. Engage doesn't mean meet them, doesn't mean invite them to an event. It means really getting a relationship going, a long-standing relationship. Really bringing people into the room or setting them down on the table and having them be engaged in the conversation. Now, this seems to be as a topic that what I found is that it kind of parts ways of on what side have you been. If you've been on the side of being overrepresented in a way, it's hard to understand how being underrepresented through all your life and all your story of your parents' life and your parents' life and back and back and back, how different it is to come to this room and to this table. And it's not because of shyness, it's because we've been invited to the room before just to them being shown out the door again. And it's kind of like a reluctance in a way of people, and engaging means also acknowledging that. Acknowledging that they've been through a history of neglect and kind of like, we have an expression in Mexico, which is kind of like a flame, you know, like when you're like sort of very excited and like, let's do this, and then that flame dies down and you're like, kind of forget about it. So underrepresented communities have a long history of, again, being sometimes invited to a table and then sometimes disinvited, again and again and again and again. So how are we to know that this is the good one, that you are really the person who are going to stay with us and engage this community over time? There's no idea. So then you really have to do the work and keep insisting and keep trying to bring these people and really engage them. And again, I really want to emphasize the aspect of long-standing relationship. The idea is that for us to engage a community, we need to, know who to call. Not make it an invisible blob of people that we don't know, but have names that we can call, and then those people can call other people, and so forth and so forth. Now, another thing is understanding that when you want to engage an underrepresented community, it should be about the underrepresented community and not about you. It shouldn't be about what you think that community should be or do, but about that community. So in a way, it's really thinking, and I think this is why it makes it very tricky, because it's really putting yourself in a vulnerable position and then be underrepresented. So let's say that I'm going to show you. This is the closing meeting of the Latino Heritage Survey in Seattle that we did back in May. And I'm going to point out to Chris here, who is the director of the Washington Trust. And I just think he was very brave, because he stood in front of a room full of mostly Latino people and just welcome them and try to engage in the conversation. And that position that Chris was for a few minutes, it was very hard to be put on. But what I think, when you've been on the other side of the conversation or on the other part of the room, what you don't understand is that this is how we mostly are. Underrepresented communities is the way we're mostly always in the situation. Like, I'm the only woman in the room, I'm the only Latino in the office. That's kind of putting yourself in that position, and of course it's not comfortable, no one likes it, but then it's that inter-exchange. It's not like, oh, now you need to suffer what we have suffered, because that's one that wouldn't be possible, and that's not the point. But the point is that we all understand why it's hard. It's putting yourself in that difficult situation of being, if I'm going to go to speak to the Latino community, and I'm going to go into El Centro de la Raza, and I have nothing to do with Latino community, of course I'm going to be by myself. But then that kind of understanding of the situation on both sides, it's important to really make that engagement. Really don't think that you need to be an envoy or you need to send an envoy, but really engaging on the conversation and building that relationship where then really that can move forward of that vulnerability of one or the other one. So I hope I did not, I made this point here. It's not about payback. It's more about being able to put yourself in that situation to engage another community. And then I guess the last point one could be push for change. If your organization or your office or yourself has achieved that diversity in preservation or are working towards that. Because the next step would be push for change beyond your own organization or your own person. And that push for change would be where it's the most meaningful. And that I think has to be in practice, in guidelines, in legislation. Most of the time I hear this, and not only in the US, also in Mexico, it's idea, well, but it's the law, that's how the law was written, so what can we do? I mean, laws are written by people and they can always change. But most of the time, laws follow the change that has already happened. They are mostly never, the law changes first and then the world. It's mostly the other way around. So then, for laws to change, really, the practice needs to change for it to really allow for that change to be possible. So then, let's keep raising the issue of diversity, and I really invite you to have this in your mind about, demographics. Okay, let's see when you go to when you look at your, for example, membership, even if you're an organization, okay, let's see about my demographics. If I'm in a neighborhood, for example, let's say I'm a neighborhood preservation small office. Hey, my neighborhood has quite a big community of people from the Philippines, but I don't have any activity or any bridge. I have not built a bridge with that community. That's a start. Okay, so that's why I think going into this, we look at demographics, at what's your number, and what's, for example, I show you the national parks of the list of national parks from Washington. If we compare them to those demographics of what is now, and again, most importantly, thinking of what used to be those demographics in the past, that's when underrepresentation is really meaningful. For a couple of years now, I've been part of this task force we've named it, which is called Beyond Integrity, and it's hosted by For Culture, which is the King County agency for the promotion of arts and culture. And Beyond Integrity was an initiative really of a group of people who started having this conversation a few years back. And it was this idea again of what can we really do? Lauren here and I started back in 2014, I think it's when it started. And it first was like a big therapy group. It was just, we would sit down and just talk about how the unfairness on the world, mostly. But then, after many of these sessions, we started thinking about more of our objectives that we wanted to do, and how could we maybe get something done. And I'm so proud to say that this actually has gone somewhere. I guess I'm not alone in saying that we thought we might never do. I mean, like it would be just like a nice wish, but nothing would happen. But for example, we sat down with the City of Seattle Landmarks Preservation Board on October, so almost last year. And we sat with them and we just presented what we've done through internships mostly. We've had wonderful interns the past summers who have done research and have been able to give us more data to back up our understanding that just there's no diversity in these terms in King County and Seattle in it. And how could the Landmarks Preservation Board change that? And it was really just a talk with them. And one, it was refreshing and hopeful to see that most of them, one, knew about this. I mean, they knew in the sense that it was something that it wasn't a surprise for them to know that there's communities that are underrepresented. And well, most of the thing is that we don't really know what to do. So this, I think, in a way, shows that sometimes there's the intention of everyone to do it, but not really the know-how of how to go around it or how to achieve it. So I think just having the conversation is a great start. Again, engaging and pushing for that change and raising the issue about this topic. So, for example, what we told the Landmarks Preservation Board of Seattle was that one of the things that they could do is to incorporate, in a way, in other words, in a way, it's incorporate that notion of intangible heritage to the conversation. They are really there just judging the tangible merits of the building, and that's why the group is called Beyond Integrity, so beyond architectural integrity, which tends to be in the preservation work to be it's like the killing argument. Oh, but the building doesn't have architectural integrity, which means that you move the wall. Sometimes it can be very small. Sometimes it's really sometimes it's really a true argument. But sometimes it's an argument used to kill every other merits. So kind of the idea what we brought to this conversation is, in a way, this notion of intangible heritage. And you cannot, the building itself is important, but some buildings are important because of what they held inside, not because of the merits of the building. And again, it's kind of like having this equal part of the physical of the building, the tangible part of the building, and all the intangible things that happen around the building. Because yes, well, some buildings are just important because of their craftsmanship or their design or the materials that were used, but so many others are important because of what they held. Because buildings and sites and cities are really a place where human life happens. So when we are taking that component out and saying that's not important, it's just really not telling our story as human race or citizens of place completely. That's, for example, one of the ways that we presented this idea of how can you think more about diversity when you make your recommendations, and it's add that component of the intangible heritage in a way to buildings. If there's don't only judge them by their merit, by their physical merits or their development attractiveness, let's say like that. But also think about what happens in this building. What community is attached to this building, and then what they told us, and they said, well, we're all volunteers. We don't really have the time to do all this research. But then one of the suggestions we gave them too was just you don't have to have like this big knowledge of history or of buildings, but where is this building? Oh, is this building in a historic Black community? Then there's a very good chance that this building is attached to that community. Am I hearing that part of the conversation in this proposal to demolish it? Yes or no? So it's really, I think we as individuals and then as organizations really keep raising the question and keep bringing the conversation back, keep asking to bring this conversation, to include this part of the conversation, we can really push for change. This is, as now, City Arts is now the font, but this was an article that came from that presentation to the board. So it was what's worth saving, and it's still online if you want to search for it, and it deals with what the work of Integrity has done until this conversation with the Landmarks Board, and it's trying to keep the conversation about how historical buildings associated with minorities are less likely to get landmarked. And this is something that we were able to achieve in Beyond Integrity by looking at just the demographics. What are the numbers in our in the counties and city of Seattle landmarks, and what representation certain for example, there's zero landmarks associated with Latino communities in Seattle that are actually landmarked. And that's just so incredible to believe, because there are places that all Latinos know that that they are important to the community. So sometimes it's just a question of saying, I cannot believe this community is completely underrepresented. Let me go talk to them and see what shall we include into our landmarks. Okay, so then again, thinking about it's a complex issue, and there's definitely laws and practices and guidelines that need to change. But if we start changing our understanding of it and raising the issue, that would be really what can we do more to push for change. And this is what I want to close my presentation with, and it's why is it important? Why is bringing diversity so important into historic preservation? And this is from that Declaration of Cultural Diversity of UNESCO from 2002. It says heritage education would help strengthen the concept of a common heritage of humanity that is the fruit of manifold exchanges between cultures and civilizations. Then, through a lexicon of forms, sensations, and meanings, the heritage will be able to offer the universal language needed to build a culturally viable future. And I just think it's because of that, because I would want to build a culturally viable future. I would like my child to live in a culturally viable world. And it's definitely this idea of the future. Historic preservation should not be seen by the lens of what I like or what interests me, but it should really be about what shall we save for the future generation. That's the idea of historic preservation, okay? And that's it. I will go here now if there's any questions or comments.
I don't know what you want to preserve. It's historical preservation you are talking, and what we have that as commission here. But what do you want to preserve? The social structure, the social tradition? I haven't heard about architecture, about buildings, because the buildings are who host the function. You know, you can't put people without building and you say, I want to preserve them. You can't do that. You build the building according to the function that you need to use, and usually you preserve the buildings or districts or houses or whatever, name it, any building, to preserve that heritage for the future generation, that they benefit from that. All what you said is demographic, statistic, and trying to do diversity, social diversity. I didn't hear anything preservation. What do you want to preserve here? You know, from all your lecture, I didn't see what do you want to preserve.
I think the idea is that it's not exactly about me.
No, not you. I'm talking about
I know. The idea is that this, to achieve diversity, I think that is to engage the community and ask them what they want to preserve. So it's not about judging the building from the outside, but understanding what the community think it's important from its past to put forward to the future. So it's a question. It's not, and I think that's the big change in how do we see preservation, is I'm not going to be the judge. I'm going to facilitate and engage the community and tell them, what's your story? What's your story? Where has this story happened? And then from there, give that building the importance of that intangible part, and then protect it because of what has happened in that building.
Still, that's nothing to do with historical preservation, because it is landmark, not social. Landmark means structure, something. Social come with it.
Okay, then the answer would be, if we keep thinking in that way, diversity in historic preservation, it's going to be very hard to achieve.
you know, there is always diversity for certain things, certain ethnic groups, certain group of people. They have their heritage, they have their type of building, they have type of tradition, they have type of social structure, they type of their conducting their life, and that always will be everywhere, anywhere. But you know what we are talking here about, I thought I will hear, since you are an architect, I will hear something. What is the method of you thinking about preserving some kind of structure that I was with this commission for 5 years. You know, I left it in 2013, and we worked on a lot of building. This has never been mentioned because it's automatically it comes from the society that living there, from the people living there. They function within that structure or that district. But what you are talking, I'm not criticizing your lecture, but I'm trying to make the connection between the landmark preservation and preservation in general, and mostly you are talking about social issues. That's all what I see.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about that with the Tacoma Preservation Office. I'd like to talk a little bit about your question because I'm with the Tacoma Preservation Office.
Yeah.
And what we're talking about, I think, is not what to preserve, but how we do preservation. And it's not that we're saying we should go beyond buildings. We still want to preserve buildings, but we want to make sure that the buildings we preserve represent the community that is around the buildings and that uses the building. So for example, in Tacoma, most of our landmarks are in the north end. Most of them represent big civic buildings or mayors or people of wealth. But what do we have that represents, the Asian community, the Native American community, the Black community? And I think so that we're trying to think of, we're preserving things not just because they look fancy, they look great, but because they're important to the community. And so we're expanding that definition a little bit because most commissions have only focused on architecture and how does it look. And then we're asking ourselves, but what is the purpose of historic preservation? It's to preserve properties as a record of our society and who is in our society.
Wait a minute, you have North Slope. They have preserved first North Slope. North Slope has population there, regardless who are they. These people are having these houses, these buildings, they live there. And you are not going to change them and bring something to improve diversity or something. These people, do you want to maintain the environment there? And so, and with the future, that people can be changing by little, or they keep preserve that whatever is this.
Absolutely.
And sometimes you preserve a building because it has significant value from the past to the present to the future. You want to transmit that value to the future generation. But when I'm talking, specifically for the lecture, it is more social than it is landmark.
Yes, and I think what we're trying to get is that the North Slope does have great buildings that represent that society, and we're not saying we should change those at all. We're saying that we should include more landmarks on the east side, on the south side that represent different
Let
communities.
me tell you something. I worked with the commission for 5 years. I was teaching at University of Washington. I'm an architect. I'm professor. So I don't want to make of myself something, but I want to convey the ideas. Preservation is you want to preserve something. Mainly in our field is the building. Some other field, they preserve tradition, they preserve art, they preserve something else. In preserving buildings that come with it, the social structure there, to preserve that building, it has value, significant value. Not necessarily it is an old building and I will preserve it. No, it has significant value. I remember when they were trying to put the wedge on the register and we were going through a process. So this is the value of it, to transmit that valuable building, valuable character to the future generation. Now, social Society is a dynamic issue. The building are static issue. Dynamic always changing. You see that populations in one, as here she mentioned, that population in certain period of time, they were so much from this race, this ethnic group. Then after 50 years, this changes because it never keeps the same thing because this is the dynamic of population.
What I would offer is that historic preservation, as it has operated now in most places, not only in the state of Washington, but the US and even most countries, has focused just on that tangible element. And that's even how most of the laws were written. What has happened, and that's just something that has happened, is that through all those places, countries and states and little towns, they've all lost buildings that they loved. They've all lost buildings and places that they were not able to pass through a landmarks board, that they were not able to preserve. And the question started being why? Why are we not being able to preserve this building? Why did we lose it? And then in the case of Seattle, for example, when we formed this group, is because it has not qualified because of architectural integrity, for example, okay? Then the conversation is, do all buildings have the same value, even when what is most important about them is that social factor, that intangible heritage? And what has happened in many places is that part has been neglected and ignored as not important, as something else. The notion of cultural heritage wants to bring it together. And ideally, it would be for the practice to change from historic preservation to heritage preservation, to cultural heritage that holds both of them equally and does not separate them. Because what you're saying is, if this building has held this practice, if you want to conserve the practice, okay, but the building is not important. And for most people and for most communities, the building is that place of significance, as you said, that has held that function. And both of them are equally important. So for example, a building that has been a commercial building, but that has held a community of artists throughout generations, and where many artists have had their studios there and developed their art. You say the art is important, but the building where this all has happened is not. Then if that would be the case, then the birthplaces of anyone wouldn't be protected. They are protected because they're the birthplace of this and that, this other. It's because of what happened. So then, in a way, when we try to separate these two things and just focus on historic needs to be historic about the building, then what happens is that we will lose and lose and lose heritage that is important for the community. And that's how how this conversation has happened, not only in my case in Seattle, but in the world too, of what are we missing? What's the component? And kind of think of it in UNESCO terms. What are we missing from the declarations that we put up in the 20s and in the 70s? What are we missing that we are losing heritage? And that's why they keep updating and incorporating new elements. If you go back to the text of the 70s, or even the first chapters when it wasn't even a UN, they never talk about diversity. They never talk about multicultural or pluralism, nothing. But it has been added to the conversation because it's been missing in a way.
Don't forget that at that time there was no such movement of population between countries and between different races moving from one area to another area. Now it's more dynamic. You see all over the world is going. So then you have to think about it, yes. But before you can't think about it because it was different. People more static, they didn't move. Now it's more they are moving for different reasons.
But even if they didn't move, when you think about that, is when you say history started when Europeans came. Because, I mean, before, it's also the idea of reaching to what was before. In most countries, there was a native population, and then someone else or somebody else came and changed that centuries ago, or even way back. So yes, it has never happened so much in so little time, but it has always happened. And I don't think we can, maybe the Galapagos Islands, but there's really not a place in the world where we can think of just like this population that has never had movement. It just has happened more spread out.